Uh, Good evening, friends. Lay down, boats. Lay down there. Come on. Come on, lay down. Uh, Tonight's talk is from the second chapter of the Dhammapada. I believe the title is the Appamadavagga. Appamadavagga, meaning refined mindfulness. Last week, the talk was on the first chapter, or this Thursday talk was on the first chapter. Lay down, come on, lay down, of the Dhammapada. And the subtitle was Mind Governs All. And in that beginning of the Dhammapada, the Buddha teaches that what is held in mind, mindfulness means to recollect or to hold in mind. So what we hold in mind will determine our life experience. So in a very broad macro way, whatever is framing our perceptions of what's occurring in our life will determine our experience of that. And on a micro level or on a Dhamma level, what we hold in mind will determine the effectiveness of our Dhamma practice. And this is an underlying theme throughout the Buddha's teaching. In fact, it relates directly to the very specific insight that the Buddha teaches that we are to be looking to gain. And this is a very specific and particular insight into the three marks of existence, and not a broad, let me talk about the three marks just for a moment. The three marks of existence are the impermanence of all things, the not self-characteristic, the word that the Buddha used would be anatta, which simply means that the views we're holding about ourselves are wrong views. They're rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And in the environment of impermanence, because of that misunderstanding, we create suffering. And so the wisdom that is gained through the Buddha's Dhamma, and specifically through the Eightfold Path, is specific insight into these three marks of existence: impermanence of all things, a misunderstanding of self, and the resulting suffering. And you could say, and why suffering results from a misunderstanding of the first two. And that relates directly to the mindfulness that I'll be talking about in this sutta, and the generalized mindfulness that is presented today. So if people that practice mindfulness in any way, any label that they put on whatever they call mindfulness, was part of a religion, it would be the world's largest religion today. Everybody is practicing something called mindfulness. Some of it's helpful in very specific ways. There's some fairly extensive studies that the proper application of mindfulness can help reduce pain and stress. And when you understand mindfulness, it's pretty easy to understand how that works. But that has taken on these elaborate and misleading applications, calling it mindfulness, when really all that it is continued eye-making, continued practices rooted in conceit, rooted in a misunderstanding of self. And that relates to this generalized type of insight now that relates directly to this generalized and broad application of mindfulness. And that is that insight into anything, whatever we decide to hold in mind, see the connection to mindfulness, is somehow a useful practice and not simply more eye-making, more conceit, more distraction. And the misapplication of mindfulness and the misapplication of insight go hand in hand when you look at it that way. And so that has resulted in, and I should say, that's all well and good. That's fine that people want to do things and call it mindfulness practice. The problem arises, and it was present during the Buddha's time, hence the many, many suttas where the Buddha's teaching the proper application of mindfulness, is that because we might be doing some kind of mindful breath work or mindful chanting or mindful walking, none of which the Buddha taught, will assume, because people present it as Buddhist practice, that we're actually doing something that may cause us or may help develop awakening. or a true useful insight into who and what we are in relation to the environment that we're in. And so it's just a distraction that way. Most of modern Buddhism, by common agreement, is just that. It's a hodgepodge and a collection of different practices, all under the label of Buddhism, that people are breathlessly engaging in, but all that they're doing is continuing their misapplication of mindfulness, continuing eye making, continuing misleading themselves and others, in a practice that, as the Buddha teaches, is very specific and a very specific application of mindfulness. And so it often feels good, especially when we can get a lot of our friends together to do these practices. And often the people that promote this get very smug simply by the number of people that they're able to mislead, rather than actually study what an awakened human being taught and call that Buddhist practice. And then we could leave the label of Buddhism that is applied so broadly that it has no meaning anymore, including to what the Buddha taught, put that aside and call it something else, whatever you might want to call it. And again, that's an underlying theme throughout the Buddha's teaching. Many of his suttas are about what it is and what it isn't. And again, remember last week's talk. Lay down, Buddha. Come on. The Buddha teaches that a wise Dhamma practitioner who has developed enough of the Dhamma to teach will know how and what to teach people to hold in mind, and how and what they should abandon or avoid clinging on to. And that's a lot of my teachings are just that way. And this sutta is a kind of refinement of that, and it relates to refined mindfulness. So lay down, Bones. Come on. Lay down. Come on, I gotta get a talk. There he goes. This is from the Dhammapada too, called the Appamadavagga. Mindfulness is the path to cessation. That first sentence describes what is the application of mindfulness as far as the Buddha is concerned. Again, it's not this broad, generalized mindfulness that can be applied to anything. I used the example before of people consider chanting as Buddhist practice. The Buddha never taught chanting at all, not once through his entire teaching career. People say, well, it helps to harmonize inner vibrations, or it might even help to deepen concentration. Well, the Buddha taught a very specific meditation practice, Shamatha Vipassana meditation, for the sole purpose of deepening concentration or deepening jhana that supports this path to cessation. And people have taken a misapplication of the Satipatthana Sutta and the Anapanasati Sutta and created walking meditation. Even tying those two things together is rooted in foolishness, isn't it? Because you're creating something that should be seen as entirely ordinary, as shown in the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta and many others. It's the simple act of walking, and now making it special because I'm doing it and I'm developing some type of practice around it. And so the act of mindful walking is actually a distraction away from developing the Dhamma. We should be mindful of what we're walking, but we shouldn't create a Dhamma practice over something that is simply ordinary. Let me continue. Mindfulness is the path to cessation. The Buddha taught a very specific path, didn't he? That he emphasized over and over again, never teaching another path, not a bodhisattva path, not a no-self path, not an inner Buddha nature path, not an interdependent path, not an interbeing path, a singular path called the heartwood of the Dhamma. Whenever the Buddha used the term, whenever I use the term, I'm referring to, and he was referring to the Eightfold Path. Mindfulness is the path to cessation. When you read the Buddha's description of the Eightfold Path, the Maghavibhanga Sutta is a very good example, but there's many others. In that sutta, the Buddha teaches that we should be mindful of each factor of the Eightfold Path. It makes sense. If that's his path to cessation, through the ending of all views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths, then we should be mindful of the factors of that path. And the Buddha would often describe that type of mindfulness. He says, when in wrong view, be mindful that you're in wrong view, meaning recognize it, and enter and remain in right view. When in wrong intention, the intention, this really fits here, the wrong intention would be intention to continue self-referential views rooted in ignorance of Four Noble Truths. And so what could be more self-referential than creating a specialized type of some kind of practice, put the label Buddhism on it, go chant and walk around and call that Buddhist practice when it has nothing to do with what the Buddha taught. And in a very subtle but sometimes very obvious ways, those are simply more strategies to continue self-referential views and the suffering that goes along with it. Mindfulness is the path to cessation, meaning mindful of each factor of the Eightfold Path. Those mindful do not suffer. Those mindful have gone beyond suffering. Again, the proper application of mindfulness doesn't teach us to manipulate stress and suffering or even to manipulate pain. It takes us beyond that. Those clearly knowing the excellence of mindfulness, the wise exulting in mindfulness, and the refuge of the noble ones, meaning the Eightfold Path. The true refuge, as the Buddha teaches in the Ratana Sutta and many others, is taking refuge in the Buddha, his Dhamma, and a well-focused Sangha. The wise ones established in Jhana, such an important line. The wise ones are those that are established in Jhana, or an authentic Jhana practice, a meditation practice that is used for the sole purpose for deepening concentration. Why? Because it is from that foundation of concentration, of ever deepening concentration, that one can support the refined mindfulness that the Buddha is talking about here. The wise ones established in Jhana and steadfast in the heartwood. To be steadfast in the heartwood again refers to the Eightfold Path. One must be established in Jhana. And there's many suttas where the Buddha teaches what Jhana practice actually is and what it is to avoid. And in every one of those suttas, we just did a series of 7 or 8 a couple months ago at Cross River Meditation Center, and all those talks are online. In every one of those suttas, the Buddha teaches to use meditation to deepen jhana in different contexts, but always in the context of deepening jhana. And every one of them to avoid establishing a self in speculative types of meditation or Dhamma practices, such as those just mentioned and others. Steadfast in the heartwood, they alone are released, freedom beyond compare. Glorious are those, energetic, pure, discerning, rightly restrained, and always mindful. Mindful of right effort, one factor of the Eightfold Path. A disciple of the heartwood, the wise, are an island unto themselves that no flood can overwhelm, and nothing that our cursory associations can distract us from. The foolish and ignorant crave mindlessness. And so the difficulty in explaining that is that mindfulness means to recollect or to hold in mind. So the mindlessness here is referring to holding in mind a type of mindfulness, but things that do not develop the Dhamma. They're mindless in their in what they will bring into our lives and help us understand. The foolish and ignorant crave mindlessness. The wise know this one treasure. Proper application of mindfulness, refined mindfulness. Sorry, I just lost my place here. Refrain from mindlessness. Refrain from sensual pleasures. Only those established in jhana and refined mindfulness attain lasting calm. Only those. The wise, looking down from the mountaintop of wisdom, having abandoned mindlessness, established in mindfulness, this peaceful sage observes the foolish and the suffering multitude. And all that means is it's not a place of aggrandizement sitting on top of the mountaintop, but we're now able to recognize what is mindless and what is mindful as it relates to the Dhamma. And if we are immersed in all the multitude of the present day mindful religion, we won't be sitting on the mountaintop. We won't be able to see this, and we'll be distracted and swept away by what we want Dhamma practice to be, by attaching mindful mindlessness to all these different various practices and religious presentations, the global religion of mindfulness and the global religion of broad insight that distracts us from actually developing the Buddhist Dhamma. And that, to me, is one of the, I don't know the right word to use when I'll use the word sad, because it does bring me sadness when I see sincere and earnest people, including many friends and close associates, that have become so distracted by the self-aggrandizing nature of modern Buddhism and the way that it's applied, and all the little subcults that come together and are now modern Buddhism by common agreement. And they are delighted by their common agreement. In other words, just because me and my friends and my associates, and there's worldwide engagement in these different mindless practices as they relate to the Buddha's Dhamma, meaning they might be mindful, but they're not mindful of anything the Buddha taught. And they simply can no longer even see the Buddha's simple Dhamma because of that. And to me, that is sad. And it keeps going back to, excuse me, it's silly to say I wish that it was different, because it is silly. This is just what's occurring. The Buddha taught the first noble truth, that dukkha occurs, and it certainly applies within and without so-called Buddhism. But by misapplying the Buddhist label, or maybe I should say applying it so freely and mindlessly, it totally obscures the simple and direct path that the Buddha taught. And so there's millions of people all over the world thinking that they're practicing something that an awakened human being taught. There's even organizations that call themselves the Triple Refuge, when it has nothing to do with what the Buddha actually taught and what he meant by taking refuge in him as a human being who awakened his teachings in a well-focused Sangha. Buddha continues. And again, just to go on for that a little bit longer, it's one of the things that I've come across now. I've been teaching, I don't know how many years, maybe a dozen years. There's many, many people that have come into Cross River meditation, and a good handful, more than a handful, have stayed and continued their practice and developed great levels of mindfulness. But a great majority of people have came, listened, maybe got a little excited, maybe not, maybe got turned off immediately, but never came back. And the same has happened online. And the point that I'm getting to, the people that seem to have the greatest affinity for what the Buddha taught and nothing else are those that have not developed other Buddhist practices and created identities in them. Those are the ones that have the most difficult time recognizing what is mindful mindlessness, meaning being mindful of anything and everything and calling it Buddhist practice, or engaging in practices other than what the Buddha taught and calling it Buddhism. Those are the ones that have the most difficulty actually listening to, learning, and developing what this singular heartwood of the Dhamma practice. And that is sad to me. Buddha continued, mindful among the mindless. This is a perfect segue into that. I didn't even realize I was doing that here at this point. Mindful among the mindless. Thinking about that, and there is a sadness, because it's difficult to see friends that, well, and anyone, not just friends and associates, but of course there's a different connection to people that you have developed a relationship with, and to people that just come and go from your life. But to understand this simple and direct path, and how easy, and I don't mean that it's instantaneous, and it does take a lot of effort, but it takes much less effort to awaken. Let me put it this way: it takes much less effort to develop the Buddha's Dhamma than it does to continue mindfulness, mindful practices that have nothing to do with the Buddha's teaching. And when you're mindful of that, when you can see it in others, when you can see it in others, it takes a proper application of wise restraint, as the Buddha teaches, to not want to do more. And when we understand what a self-referential ego self is rooted in, it's rooted in more. It's never satisfied. And so it's an aspect of I-making to take it beyond simply presenting the Dhamma, but there's a sadness there. And I think that's what the Buddha is talking about even 2,600 years ago, because he was certainly mindful among the mindless. Mindful among the mindless, awake among those asleep, the wise advance like a swift horse. And I guess that's really what I was referring to, that you develop the Dhamma rather quickly when you can stay focused and mindful of only what the Buddha taught. But you will be advancing. You'll be leaving people behind. And I think that's one of the reasons that people have a very difficult time in not continuing Buddhism by common agreement, because they realize that they are leaving many of their associates behind. What they're failing to understand is that they're then in a better position to be truly helpful towards others. As the Buddha taught last week, that the greatest, well, it was last week's sutta, but the greatest gift we can give ourselves and all others is to take to the Dhamma and awaken. And at least in that way, when we advance like a swift horse through proper application of mindfulness, we are no longer contributing to the ignorance and the suffering that follows from that of others by our tacit approval of being a part of that. It's one of the reasons why, from the very beginning, I've put right effort in creating a meditation center that is owned, against, despite some very irate people, to keep it just focused on what the Buddha taught. But it's paid off for those that have continued. They've advanced like swift horses. The Buddha continues, by mindfulness is one exalted. By mindfulness is one exalted. Proper application of mindfulness. Mindfulness is always praised by the wise, and mindlessness is always despised. And again, it has to be very clear here, because people misunderstand it, like that the Buddha is teaching that we should despise people that are engaged in mindful mindlessness practices. It's that application of mindlessness that is despised, not the person. And it is despicable. The point of this talk, it's despicable. It's worth being despised of, to practice something other than what the Buddha taught and call it Buddhist mindfulness. Mindlessness always despised. The Dhamma practitioner who delights in mindfulness and is fearful of mindlessness advances like fire burning away all of the fetters, greed, aversion, and deluded thinking. Fire burning away all the fires. And this is the Buddha here, excuse me again. If you think about the Buddha or a wise Dhamma practitioner giving this teaching, it's a teaching on encouragement, isn't it? It's not a teaching against something. The self-referential ego personality might see it that way. The Buddha is offering encouragement to those interested in the Dhamma, in his Dhamma. The Dhamma practitioner who delights in mindfulness and is fearful of mindlessness advances like a fire burning away all fetters. What he's saying is, if you simply refine your mindfulness to hold in mind the heartwood of the Dhamma and avoid the self-referential need, the compulsive need to adapt, accommodate, and embellish it in any way, It's like a fire burning away all the fetters. The Dhamma practitioner who delights in mindfulness and is fearful of mindlessness will not lose the way. We won't become distracted by distracting and mindless practices. They are close to release. Close to release by the simple and direct and proper application of refined mindfulness. That's the end of the Appamadavagga Sutta. This refined application of mindfulness is the essence of a mind rooted in jhana, rooted in concentration, because, and just to make the connection through the whole path, the reason why the Buddha taught a singular meditation method that is solely designed to deepen jhana, and if you simply read the Buddha's teachings, you'll understand he's taught nothing else, because it is a mind that is well concentrated, that can avoid the distraction of compulsive mindfulness, which is really mindlessness, as the Buddha teaches here, and use that concentration to develop the refined mindfulness, to hold in mind only what the Buddha taught as a Dhamma practice, and not get distracted by our associations, by special practices, by Buddhism, by common agreement, simply because everybody else is doing it, or charismatic teachers are teaching it, who many have never actually studied what the Buddha taught and are teaching something right from the beginning. The foundations of their teachings are not rooted in what the Buddha taught, rather they're rooted in cultural and charismatic, individually influenced so-called mindfulness that has nothing to do with what the Buddha taught. So thank you for listening. If you find benefit from this talk, please consider a donation at becoming-buddha.com. Peace.